after a popular couple mysteriously disappeared from their upscale waterfront home. Concerned family members rushed to help. What they found was a twisted scheme of betrayal.
I'm Kathy with a K.
And I'm Kathy with a C.
And this is Killer Destinations. Today's destination is Singer Island, Florida. Now, despite its name, Kath, Singer Island is actually a peninsula. And it's located within the city limits of Riviera Beach and Palm Beach shores. It's bordered on the east by the Atlantic Ocean and on the west by the Intercoastal Waterway, and was named after Palm Beach developer Paris Singer, who was the 23rd son, no joke, of Isaac Singer, the sewing machine magnate.
Between 6 women, though. Important to note.
And yeah, I think he was married to 3 or 4 at the same time. This was like late 1880s, early 1900s, where there weren't like databases to check.
Exactly.
The island is known as a family-friendly beach getaway with 7 miles of pristine white sand beaches and is a premier destination for snorkeling, scuba diving, and fishing. The surrounding waters and tiny islands off Singer Island offer some of the best spots for paddleboarding, swimming, and diving. Due to its peaceful atmosphere and low crime rate, it attracts a lot of affluent retirees. The median age of its almost 3,000 year-round residents is 68 years old. But in 1998, after a popular husband and wife mysteriously vanished, residents wondered if something sinister was afoot in their little stretch of paradise.
In 1998, David and Karen Nicholson lived on Singer Island and absolutely loved it. They lived a quiet life, they enjoyed outdoor activities, and they had a bunch of close friends who lived nearby. So in November that year, specifically November 11th, Karen called up a group of friends and said, "Hey, I just want to make sure you're all coming to my house tonight. Looking forward to seeing everybody." And all of the couples indicated that, "Yep, we'll be there. Looking forward to it." So the group of friends show up at the Nicholson house that evening, except one couple, Chris Benedetto and his wife, Jeanette Pirro. And so Karen thought it was odd because she had spoken with Jeanette earlier that day, and Jeanette confirmed they were coming, but they weren't overly concerned. They figured they'd show up, but they never did. So Karen's husband called Jeanette's next door neighbor and said, "Hey, listen, Chris and Jeanette were supposed to be at our house, but they're not here and they're way too late for this to be normal. Can you just go next door and knock on the door and see what's going on?" And Karen told her husband, "Listen, don't worry too much about that. You know how Chris and Jeanette like to live spontaneously. They could have taken an unplanned trip. They could have done something else tonight. Let's not worry too much about it." Well, the neighbors called back and said, "Look, I don't know where they are. Their truck's gone and no one's answering the door." So Karen was like, "Okay, let's not worry about it. Let's enjoy our evening." So Chris Benedetto was 42 years old at the time, and Jeanette was 45. And Chris was retired. Actually, he was forced into retirement after falling on a construction site 9 years prior. Now, he fell from a scaffold, breaking his back, and had to have 3 major surgeries. And so this fall left him completely disabled. He was able to get around, but he had constant, persistent pain in his back. He had to use a walker and he was kind of hunched over. He looked older than his years. And he took daily pain medication, to help provide relief. So from his construction accident, Chris received a $2 million settlement. And according to Kathy,
and I'm always right, in 2026 dollars, that's 5.7 mil.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't trade my health for $5.7 million.
I agree 100%.
And I bet Chris wouldn't have either.
I bet you're right.
Yeah. Anyway, so he and his wife wound up in Florida in 1995, and they had come from New York. And Chris's doctor was like, "Listen, if you ever slip on, ice or trip in the snow or whatever, you could be paralyzed for life." Well, of course, he and Jeanette were like, "Peace out. We're going to go to Florida where it's nice and warm." In addition, Chris loved the ocean and loved fishing. This was the perfect place for him to retire to.
So Kathy was talking about this group of friends always getting together and being super close, and as a result, several of them had keys to one another's houses. So what had happened is, of course, after they found out that the neighbor had knocked, no answer, and Chris's forerunner was gone, they waited a couple days because if they took off impetuously, let's give them time to come home. But neighbors are going past the house and noticing that the mail is stacking up. So after a few days, Karen and David and a few of their other friends who were part of that nighttime dinner party let themselves in to Chris and Jeanette's home, and they went through it searching for any proof that they had actually taken off somewhere on vacation. They were looking for tickets, receipts, itineraries, anything that might serve as proof that they intentionally left that home. But even though the couples were in there, they didn't find anything that showed that they might have gone on an unexpected trip, so they were now officially worried. Now, one of the things about all these neighbors being close is that Karen and David especially knew Chris's brothers. So they called Chris's brothers in New York and said, we're a little worried. Have you heard from them? Because we just want to make sure they're okay. And the brothers were like, no, we haven't heard from them. And by this time, Kath, it had been 5 or 6 days. The brothers were like, but you know what? If you're worried, we'll call the police and we'll see what we can find out from some of our relatives. Maybe they've heard from them. And it's also important to note, Kath, that both of these brothers, one was retired PD and then the other was active PD up in New York. So the brothers called the police down in Florida and said, hey, can you do a welfare check on Chris and Jeanette's house? The neighbors are concerned, mail stacking up, anything you can find would be helpful. So the police toddled on over to Chris and Jeanette's house, as police are wont to do. Mm-hmm. And inside the house, they didn't notice anything strange or out of place. There were no signs of burglary, no forced entries, no windows unlocked, and there was no signs of like a burglary, a struggle, anything. And in the garage, they found Jeanette's BMW. Now remember, the neighborhood said that Chris's forerunner was gone, but Jeanette's car was still there. There wasn't really much to go on, and, after the neighbors rifling through the house, there might not be anyway. But police did find something that was of concern. Chris's medication that he took daily after his accident, along with his wallet and cell phone, were inside the house. These were not things they'd leave behind if they went on a trip. And it led detectives to believe that when Chris and Jeanette left their house, it wasn't something that was planned, but rather a spur-of-the-moment thing. So as we mentioned, the neighbors called Chris's brothers. After Chris's brothers called the cops, they called Michael Koblin, who was actually married to Jeanette's sister and was a frequent fishing buddy of Chris's. Michael would go down all the time, fish with Chris. They did a little business together. And so they called Michael and said, hey, they're missing. Do you know anything about it? And he's like, I don't, but I'm going to head down there right now. Brother-in-law Michael gets on a plane immediately, flies down to Florida, and when he gets there, because he had known Chris so well as part of the fishing world, so to speak, Michael heads down to the marina because he knows that they might have seen something. So after brother-in-law Michael goes to the marina, he goes back to Chris and Jeanette's house and talks to the neighbors. And he said, hey, you know what? I was able to talk to these people at the marina. They all said they saw Chris and Jeanette that night, and they were getting on a boat with another couple, and they were heading down to the Bahamas for a week or so. So I think they're okay. Like, super cool that you're worried about it, but I actually am relieved. I'm not concerned anymore. Now, after Michael has this news, Chris's two brothers still flew down from New York a couple of days after Michael got there because they wanted to offer their assistance to police in the case and see if they could find anything out. And then Kathy, also joining them on Singer Island, was their cousin, Arthur Esposito. Brothers are PD, cousin Arthur is as well. He had actually retired from the NYPD after 25 years of service and then moved down to Florida and became a detective in a city called Titusville, which was about 2 hours north of Singer Island.
3 days after the Benedetto brothers and the cousin arrived on Singer Island, so the Italian mafia is now down in Florida.
The New York Italian mafia.
Exactly. Chris's Toyota 4Runner was found in a parking lot of a hotel in Palm Beach Shores. Now, this is just less than a mile from their home in Singer Island. So family and friends were hopeful that they'd be found soon, but they remained missing. Nobody could figure out where the heck Chris and Jeanette were, and if they were in the Bahamas, why was their 4Runner in the parking lot of a local hotel? But unfortunately, detectives had no idea how long the 4Runner had been there because the hotel cameras had, already started erasing over itself. So the local police, which were the Riviera Beach Police, brought in crime scene techs from Palm Beach Police Department to process the Forerunner along with Chris and Jeanette's home and Chris's 32-foot fishing boat. It was during this step that techs noted that there were several very expensive fishing rods missing, which they thought might be logical if they were in the Bahamas. Then they noticed there was no anchor line or even an anchor on Chris's boat, which was not normal.
Anybody who owns a boat, which we do, you always have an anchor. And our boat is not as large as the 32. It's only 23 and a half feet.
It's a little lake boat.
But we have an anchor. We have tons of lines. And so for a boat that large, not to have any of that, that's really strange.
Yeah, no, totally strange. An ocean boat, you got to have it. And I just totally had a funny memory pop into my head about our boat.
Oh, no.
Oh, listen, do you remember when your sister took out like 10 kids to do like inner tubing or whatever?
We were just talking about that, not you and I, but my nephew and I were just talking about that a couple days ago.
And ran out of gas.
Yes.
Because our gas gauge was broken. Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
Yeah, and that actually prompted us to get it fixed, but ran out of gas in the middle of the lake. And so what do you have? Every boat has an oar. And so she put the kids, were they at the bow of the boat?
8. Well, they were all along it. They were
along the boat.
They were at the bow, and then because this boat fits like 12 pretty easily.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, they're little
kids. Yeah, not adults. It fit like 8 adults.
Oh my God. But she was gone for hours. Anyway, they were using like the oar and the paddle boards and the skis as like,
you know, the wakeboards.
Exactly. To row themselves to shore. And then finally someone saw her, felt sorry for her because I have to say about like boating, people are very helpful.
Yeah. Most of the time. Yes.
Yeah. And campers are always very helpful.
Yes.
But anyway, so some guy saw this, got on a jet ski and wound up towing the boat with all the kids in it to get some gas.
And he was actually law enforcement from one of the neighboring counties.
Oh, was he?
Yeah.
Okay.
But here's the funny thing. So the conversation I was having with my nephew, who is, I don't even know how old, he was probably like 8 or 9 at the time. He said that what he remembered is they said to my sister, why are we trying to row? The boat is super heavy. The boat's like 4,000 pounds. And they're like, we're not going anywhere. We're not moving anywhere. And she said, the point isn't to get anywhere. It's so that people know our boat doesn't work.
Right.
And he was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Because if you're just like drifting out in the middle of the lake, they're going to think you stop, prop check, something like that.
Yeah.
And so they're really just props.
I pulled somebody in once, like there was a couple out in the middle of wherever. And I feel like I was with one of my daughters. And so I was like, here, take a rope. I'll pull you over the gas or to get gas at the dock. And I'm coming in slowly.
I was going to say,
but I was still going too quickly, and so I'm trying to slow it down, but obviously I have a rope. I got to get out of the way. And so they came into the dock just too fast. Fortunately, it wasn't that bad. There were some strong dock workers.
Strapping young men who like to work on the dock.
They did bump the dock and I was like, sorry.
The dock with the gas station. Let's be like very clear.
Exactly. But anyway, okay.
Okay, that's our boat fun.
Yeah.
Really quickly, before I forget, but this just reminded me of it because of when I was talking to my nephew. Guess who I saw this past weekend? You'll never guess.
I have no idea.
Judge Julianne.
Oh.
And her middle daughter.
Where did you see them?
Who is a beautiful young woman.
Oh, yeah, totally.
At church. Good Friday Mass.
Nice.
And I told her we're going to mention her because she said she listens every time just in case we mention her. And then she said, I need to listen to make sure that you guys aren't like impugning me in any way. Right. And I'm like, we would never do that.
We would never do that on microphone. We would do it only in person.
And then because I said, we would never do that. And she started laughing and she's like, I know you guys too well. And I'm like, well, we wouldn't do it for everyone else. We'd cut that part out.
Right.
So yes, I did say I was going to mention her. I didn't want to forget that.
Nice.
Okay. Can we go back to the missing people?
I suppose so.
Okay.
According to a 1998 article in the Palm Beach Post by Joe Brogan.
Joe Brogan or Joe Rogan?
Not Joe Rogan.
Is it his bro?
Probably.
Could you imagine his life?
I know.
Hi, I'm Joe Brogan.
I'm Joe Brogan. Yeah, exactly. Joe Brogan's really bitter that there's actually a Joe Rogan. Anyway, so according to this article, while on Singer Island, the Benedetto brothers and cousin Arthur, the mafia contingency from New York, they stayed at Chris and Jeanette's house, and they basically were like, we don't know where they are, and so we're not moving in. We're just going to stay here and babysit the home until they get here.
And why pay for a hotel if you don't have to?
Exactly. So they were sleeping on their couches, and they had put up an air mattress on the living room floor, and they were just checking out the house. They were,
They were kind of combing through it, looking for minute details like a blood fleck here or a stain over there.
Exactly. And they found nothing. So they basically took their focus outside the house. And they were handing out flyers to the neighbors. They were searching hotels on the island. They were visiting any place they could to basically, have you seen these people?
But in Joe Brogan's article, they did make it very clear that the brothers were like, we are not here to investigate and step on the toes of the actual investigators.
Right.
We're just trying to do what any family would.
We're just here to investigate.
Exactly. Surreptitiously.
Don't mind us.
With the rest of the mafia.
Exactly.
If somebody disappears, it's not our fault.
Right. Totally. So after being on the island for 4 days without making any headway, brothers George and Paul Benedetto and cousin Arthur decided it was time to return to New York. So they began tidying up the house, turning off all the lights, turning off the electricity. And so they were just closing up the house because they knew they were going to leave the following morning. So Paul went into the garage to make sure there wasn't anything that he'd missed, and he stumbled back into the living room screaming these blood-curdling screams. So, of course, the other two guys were like, what the, is going on? And Paul can't speak. They think he's clearly going into shock. He couldn't say anything. He was like...
He was frozen.
He was frozen and shaking. So his brother George is like, what the hell? And he goes into the garage to see if he could figure out what happened. And everything looks normal. And then he sees this freezer, one of those large chests, and the lid is up. He walks over, and inside he finds the frozen body of Chris's wife, Jeanette. So now George and cousin Arthur are freaking out. They immediately call 911, and they ask for the police and an ambulance for Paul.
After police get there, this Italian mafia contingent are interviewed for a second time by investigators. But then once they were interviewed, they were allowed to return home to New York and Titusville, Florida. According to investigators, at that point, everybody was under suspicion, as, would be the case with any investigation.
Right.
And, the biggest thing, Kath, is that Chris was unaccounted for. So they now have Jeanette's body. Does that mean Chris did it? So they need to consider this to be a very real possibility, and they start looking into their relationship. They're talking to the couples, they're talking to family members, but everybody said they not only loved each other, they really liked each other. Like, this was a happy, stable couple. So, of course, Chris does have to remain on the suspect list, but they continued to treat his disappearance as a missing persons case as well. One of the things that the Italian mafia contingent was able to tell police officers before they flew home to their respective cities was that the three men had discovered that there was a lot of Jeanette's jewelry that was missing. It was estimated to be about $100,000 worth, and it included Jeanette's 4-carat engagement ring.
How did they know that?
Well, because when they found Jeanette, of course, they didn't see a ring on the finger because 4 carats is a big ring.
Fairly noticeable.
And so when they were going through the house, they actually started looking through her jewelry box and realized that not only was that gone, but apparently she always wore a tennis bracelet as well. And then the jewelry box clearly looked like somebody had rifled through it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, since Jeanette's body had been in the freezer, which police assumed it was 13 days, which was the last time Jeanette was seen, they weren't able to do an autopsy right away because, of course, they had to wait for the body to thaw. Ultimately, it was determined that Jeanette had ligature marks around her neck and was killed by strangulation. But because there were no scrapings found under Jeanette's fingernails, no tissue or anything, investigators believed she'd probably been killed by someone she knew because they were able to get close to her without her putting up a fight.
Okay, so now police know they have a murder. So they're going to canvass the neighborhood again and interview people in greater depth. So during the course of their canvass, they find a neighbor. Now, he was not close to Chris and Jeanette, like he wasn't part of the inner circle of their friends, but he was a friendly guy and he knew who they were. And he's basically said, look, I don't know if this is anything, but on the day they disappeared, I noticed that around 8 o'clock in the morning, he saw a car pull up to Chris and Jeanette's house around 8 o'clock in the morning. There was nothing particularly suspicious about it. He just was being a man in his late 60s watching his neighbor.
Exactly. His own personal neighborhood watch.
Exactly. I can't imagine with all these old people in this neighborhood, everyone saw everything.
As long as it happened before 8 p.m.
Exactly. Exactly. So this happened at 8 a.m. So he sees this guy get out of this vehicle and go up to Chris and Jeanette's home. He then later notices the same man and Chris going out on Chris's fishing boat. He then tells police, oh, and by the way, Chris didn't return from the fishing trip, just the man did. And then I saw him drive off in Chris's 4Runner. So, number one, this neighbor observed everything. And now, of course, detectives are on like, oh my gosh, who was this? And so this neighbor is giving a description of the guy. And the police are like, do you think you could identify him if you see him again? And the guy was like, yeah, I mean, I saw him getting out of your police car. And so they're like, what?
Excuse me?
Excuse me? So he's like, yeah, a couple days after the disappearance, he got out of one of the patrol cruisers. And as it turns out, the man that this neighbor was referring to was Michael Koblin, Jeanette and Chris's brother-in-law and Chris's fishing buddy. But because Michael and Chris were known to be fishing buddies, police weren't exactly sure if this neighbor saw Michael on the day of the disappearance or whether there was some other reasonable explanation.
But remember, Michael Koblin didn't even fly down to Florida from New Jersey where he lived until after the neighbors had called Chris's brothers, and then the brothers called Michael. But the police are still like, you know what? This needs to be someone we just do a deeper dive into, right? We got to cross all the T's, dot all the I's. So as they look into it, Kathy, they learned that Michael had borrowed $165,000 from Chris for a trucking business, which later filed for bankruptcy. And Michael had only been able to pay back $50,000 in that loan. And then, Kath, here was the strange thing. So doing a deeper dive into Michael's financial records, they discovered that he had opened an American Express card under the name Mike Carey. That American Express card was used to purchase a plane ticket from Newark, New Jersey to West Palm Beach, Florida, the day before Chris and Jeanette vanished. And he checked into a hotel that same day using a fake name, but then signed the guest registry with his actual address in New Jersey.
Ruh-roh.
FBI agents were also able to match the handwriting on the registry to Michael, confirming that he used the alias to allegedly pull off the crime. Investigators believed that Michael killed Chris on the boat and then knocked his body overboard using the anchor and the anchor rope to send him down to the depths of the ocean. And then he returned to the house where he strangled Jeanette with another rope from the boat. Now, Kath, the final piece of evidence that convinced detectives that Michael Koblin was responsible was Jeanette's missing 4-carat princess cut diamond ring. When investigators checked phone records for the hotel Mike Carey, the alias Mike Koblin was using, on the day of the murder, they discovered several phone calls. So they called a couple of the numbers, and one of them was a jewelry store in New Jersey. And the owner confirmed for detectives that he had purchased the ring from Michael a few days after Jeanette and Chris disappeared for $25,000, cutting the stone into several smaller diamonds. So investigators were actually able to convince this jeweler to call Michael and tell him he received a subpoena in Florida to testify and ask him to come into the shop so I can talk to you about it. And then they're like, oh, by the way, are you comfortable wearing a wire for this? And the jeweler was like, abso-freaking-lutely. I'm paraphrasing. But he did. Michael comes in, and the jeweler was able to record everything that was talked about when they discussed the sale of Jeanette's engagement ring. In June of 2003, this is 4.5 years after Chris Benedetto disappeared and Jeanette Pirro was killed, Michael Koblin was arrested and charged with murder, interstate stalking, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and interstate transportation of stolen property.
Kath, I think it took so long because they were probably trying to find Chris's body.
And because of the interstate part of some of this, this wasn't a state case anymore. It was a Fed case. So in this federal case now, the federal prosecutors stated that they believed Michael Koblin killed Chris Benedetto while on a fishing trip at sea after Chris pressed him for a payback of the $165,000 loan for the trucking company.
Which he'd been doing recently.
Right, exactly.
He'd been wanting Michael to pay up.
And even though it's difficult to get a conviction without a body, in 2005, the jury of 5 men and 7 women found Michael Koblin guilty on all charges.
Boom.
At the sentencing hearing, Chris Benedetto's 4 brothers, 3 sisters, and more than a dozen family members filled the courtroom for the sentencing. None of Michael Koblin's relatives, including Jeanette's sister Regina, and Kath, at this point, I have no idea if they're still married.
I'm guessing no.
I'm guessing no too, but I just hadn't heard it either way. But none of them were even present for this trial. The 3 siblings who addressed the court urged maximum consecutive sentences. Chris's younger sister, Rosemary, said that Michael Koblin should never see the daylight or have the opportunity to experience anything in life except misery. His brother, George, and remember, this is one of the 2 who went down to Florida to try and help search for Chris and Jeanette. Kath, his broke my heart because he said, I want to know where my brother is. Where did you dump him in the ocean? Because he said he wakes up almost every night in a cold sweat because he keeps having this recurring nightmare that he sees Chris at the bottom of the ocean reaching his hands up to him, and George is reaching his hands down through the water trying to get him, and he can never quite reach him.
That's awful.
Horrible. Absolutely horrible.
Terrible. So as you can imagine, Michael Koblin's attorneys argued that consecutive sentences were unnecessary because their client was in poor health. The trial was delayed for weeks because the defendant was diagnosed with major heart problems, and the jury was shown a deposition. And in the deposition, the defendant was this sort of like hefty, large guy, and he used to go by Big Mike. And so, the jury saw this like robust, large man in videotape testimony, but in front of them at trial, Mike Koblin was gaunt. He was the shadow of a person that he used to be. And so his attorneys were like, he's very ill. It's not necessary that he be given consecutive sentences, blah, 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 blah. However, the federal judge basically said, you know what? I'm absolutely convinced that you murdered Chris and Jeanette. And the only way for justice to be served is if you serve 2 life sentences back to back in recognition of the 2 lives that you took. In May of 2005, 7 years after Jeanette Pirro was murdered and Christopher Benedetto disappeared, Michael Koblin's sentence was issued. He got an additional 10 years for interstate trafficking of stolen goods, and that was for Jeanette's jewelry that he had taken. And although Koblin was found guilty, he never confessed to murdering Chris or Jeanette. And tragically, for this family, he took his secrets to the grave because 2 years after his sentencing, he died in prison from a heart attack. Chris Benedetto's body has never been found. So, thanks for listening, and people have been asking about my brother, and so it's pretty terrible. And he's being fed nutrition intravenously. They actually tried to give him feeding into his stomach. They wanted his stomach to stay active, but whatever they were putting in his stomach was coming out his intestines, so that was not working. It was coming out the hole that's left in his intestines. The fact of the matter is he has a hole in his upper intestines, and they're hoping it scars over, but so far it has not. Whether it has shrunk, I'm not sure, because the scans they're looking at can't show precisely the size. And so my brother was stepped down out of the hospital into an acute care facility, but he may be put back there. But he's completely lucid. Like, they were saying, we don't know if he's going to have brain damage, blah, blah, blah. No brain damage. He's having full and complete conversations. He understands everything that's going on around him. And I think he vacillates between, being very like, oh my God, how am I going to make it through this, to having a sense of humor. So his sense of humor is still very clearly there. His pain medication's significantly reduced. I mean, so there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. There's a lot of things that are going his way, and his vitals are good and all this kind of stuff. It's this dang hole in the duodenum, and those don't typically heal. They can scar over. It's very rare. But again, I've said this before, it's taught me a lot about myself, how impatient and fearful I could be. So just being near somebody and observing their journey of suffering and the ups and downs that entails has been difficult, but also there have been so many little blessings sprinkled throughout. 2 months ago, I didn't think I'd be hearing myself say these words, but honestly, he's a freaking champion, and he's
a fighter.
Yeah. Oh my God. Strong as anything. But anyway, so that's the update. So we'll see how things shake out. His wife and daughter are awesome, but they're just like, they know everything there is to know about his case. It's so impressive. Everyone's on top of it. So please keep my family in your prayers, especially my brother.